Welcome, guys. So the main topic I have in store today actually came out of our last meeting, where this concept of placing or seeming to place ideology above people is a big barrier to successful persuasion. But a discussion came up on Twitter that I think is like broadly related to this that I just want to say a few words on. And that is even how to think about the label of objectivism, which these sessions are for anybody interested in liberty, but just as a reality, and in part by design, most of the people interested in what I'm doing at this point in time come to this through their interest in Ayn Rand's philosophy. And that's something that I want to encourage and nurture, because in the end, I think that is the only philosophy capable of really defining and defending liberty successfully. Plus, it's not just a means to politics. It's certainly been an incredible benefit to my life, and I think can be a benefit to people's lives. And I guess the discussion came out of a certain discomfort some people had in calling themselves objectivists. In part, it sounds too much like a religion, like I'm a Mormon, I'm an objectivist, and it puts it all on the same level of like I'm buying in to some dogma. And then related or in addition to that, there was also a feeling among some people that like, I don't really want to be connected with or responsible for the objectivist subculture. Like there's a lot of jerks, so there are a lot of dogmatists, or whatever the particular complaint was. And so I did want to say a few words about this. And as I mentioned, I think it sets up this ideology versus people issue pretty well. And the main thing I have to say is just, this is not like what you label yourself philosophically is not one of the most important issues in life. And really, I think the only place where this comes up is it comes up in a situation where you're classifying yourself philosophically for the purposes of communication. So like it can be helpful in many contexts if I'm arguing for a position to say, oh, this is the objectivist view, because it gives people a way to file my argument, to understand it, and to go research it further. Whereas if I was just giving an argument in a vacuum, they're trying to file something that they can't relate the argument to. This is assuming they have some concept of who Ayn Rand is and what objectivism is. Certainly as a public advocate for ideas, it would be really weird for me not to, mention, oh, by the way, I'm an objectivist, right? Because that would in effect not crediting Ayn Rand, and it's not like people wouldn't notice at a certain point. There's also a context that even if you're not publicly advocating for her ideas, you'll probably run into, assuming you live a certain kind of life, people say, in effect, what's your secret, right? Because presumably you'll be living unconventionally, hopefully more successfully, hopefully happier, and people will pick up on that. And in that kind of context, saying, I'm an objectivist, you don't have to. You could certainly just say, oh, I learned a lot from Ayn Rand. But in those kinds of contexts, it's a communication device. But I think, as you can see, it's such a side issue. I mean, it's helpful to remember why Ayn Rand even came up with the term, right? Because it wasn't, I'm declaring a new philosophy that I want to spread in the world. It was, she had developed a philosophy for herself, and for herself as an artist trying to portray the ideal man. And suddenly people were sitting around calling themselves Randists, and she did not want that association, right? Like she didn't want her name to be tied to the ideas in that way, and certainly not to people's whatever their misinterpretations were of the ideas. And so, that it was the opposite of like trying to establish a religion where she was eager and desperate for people to go around calling themselves objectivists. And the Onkar Ghate, somebody who's really smart and whom I've worked with and continue to work with in various capacities, has made the point that objectivism as a label, like that shouldn't be part of your identity, that a healthier identity should be, I'm somebody interested in the truth, Like, I'm interested in figuring out what's true. And then objectivism is just, well, here's both something that I think is important and true, and is a empowering tool for discovering new truths. But that if you ever have a rift between your identity and reality, that's really a problem, right? Because it's one of the reasons people can feel very threatened when they don't know the answer to some argument, right? And particularly when you're young, once you become attracted to ideas, there's a real temptation to feel like, all right, now I have to protect this, because if it's threatened, my whole worldview is threatened. And worse, if you're defining your personal identity in those terms, like, who are you? I'm an objectivist. Then now that your whole identity is threatened. And so the much healthier attitude is, I'm not tied to any specific content. I'm tied to a certain orientation towards reality. And there, your identity can never be shaken. It can only be improved and reinforced. I think I found that a really helpful point. On the subculture thing, I am so sympathetic to this, because I'm not a big fan of the objectivist subculture. I think there's a lot that's good in it. I think there's a lot of really amazing people in it. But overall, I mean, one of the things I'm trying to do is make it better, make it healthier. And in particular, one of the things you'll notice is that I have a lot of my friends on my podcast, Liberty Unlocked. And there's two reasons for that. Number one, they just have very valuable things to say. But it's not like, I'm sort of desperate for guests and have to take whoever I happen to know. It's that I remember years ago being at a party with some of my friends and thinking, the world would have a very different view of what objectivism was and what its value was if they spent time with my friends, rather than, the typical way that people encounter the ideas is either some like cantankerous debate on Twitter, or even more likely, there was that guy in college they ran into who was just discovering the ideas and went through, kind of a jerk phase, and that kind of sticks with them their whole life. And so I'm very sympathetic to people who want to distance themselves from the subculture, if you want to think of it as the movement. And, but what I would encourage people is, if you're one of the better people, instead of sort of distancing yourself, like, marginalize the bad people by being front and center as one of the really good people. Because some of the best people, not just best thinkers, but, the best people that I met have been really positively impacted by this philosophy. And it would be a real shame to surrender that because there's some, loudmouth jerks or just weirdos or whatever the case may be. It's worth mentioning too, that I don't regard this as the fault of objectivism, that there's this subculture. One of the points another point that Onkar has made, and I think Leonard might have even made it himself, is whenever you have a view that's outside the mainstream, you attract two kinds of people, right? You attract people who are better than the mainstream and worse than the mainstream, and want an excuse to look down on the mainstream that's rejected them, and reject them for like largely or understandable, if not legitimate, good reasons. And so in effect, what you really want is just highlight the best. It's just a matter of justice. You want to highlight and reward the best people and let that rise to the top. And so one of the things, as I mentioned, that I want to do with Liberty Unlocked is really highlight people that you may have never heard of before, but whom are very relatable, very interesting, very happy, who are very healthy in their attitude toward philosophy. So that's just a few words. I'm curious if you guys have any thoughts on this issue. You should be able to unmute yourself. If not, just let me know in the chat, and presumably I will have the chops to unmute you. All right. I'm just making sure that I am not missing anything. Okay. All right, cool. So with that out of the way, I want to get on to ideology versus people, because I think there's some really useful stuff here about persuasion. And when I was younger, and I mean, this was really well into my 20s, I saw every issue. Like, I was very interested in writing and communicating about philosophy, but everything was seen as a means to promoting the philosophy. Like, if I felt like I was writing about antitrust or romantic love or whatever the specific issue, I felt like this was kind of a waste of time until I could get to the abstractions. Like, my goal in writing about antitrust was to convince people of, individual rights and capitalism. My goal in writing about romantic love would be to get them to selfishness. It would always be to get to the abstraction, and concretes were just this kind of annoying excuse since I couldn't just write about the abstraction all day. And it was so interesting to read Ayn Rand's view in The Art of Nonfiction. There's a whole chapter on applying philosophy without preaching it. And I highly recommend reading and even rereading, because I remembered it being good. And then when I reread it this morning, I was like, holy God, this is so much better than I remembered it. But just to give a flavor of some points that she makes there that were transformational for me, she says, you need to grasp that there is no such thing as objectivism or any other philosophy. Every abstraction and thus every principle is manifested in an incalculable number of concretes. It is what the concretes have in common, but it does not exist apart from them. To be an Aristotelian all the way down, you must grasp that only concrete events, concrete relationships, concrete problems exist. Let the objectivism in your article come naturally out of your material and your presentation of it. Never make the communication of your philosophy a special assignment. That belongs in theoretical articles only. But you see this idea that, like, the stress is on only particulars exist, only concretes exist. In effect, she's making the point that what I had thought was the right orientation was the complete reverse of the truth, that individual rights, capitalism, objectivism, these are only important insofar as they helped us understand and navigate things like, what are the proper laws regarding monopoly? What is the best way to find, nurture, and enjoy romantic relationships? That it's the specificity of you living your life and other people living their life, that abstractions are just a means to helping us do that in the concrete, to solve real problems, to achieve real values. And that when you elevate philosophy, objectivism, or any of these other abstractions above reality, then you're completely on a different philosophic premise. That you cannot serve your philosophy if your philosophy is Aristotelian, because your philosophy by its very nature is only there to serve you. And so obviously, this is important in the way that you live your life so that you actually get the benefit of philosophy and understand it in the right way. But this is also important in terms of persuasion. And that's the thing that I want to focus on. I think one of I don't know if I could say the biggest, but certainly a major reason why we fail to be persuasive is anytime people get the sense that we are not ideological in the good sense of having fundamental principles that shape our thinking, but when it's those principles are put above people, which is another way of saying the abstraction are more important to us than the concretes. So it's, an example would be, we need to abolish the welfare state because it violates individual rights. When we say that, what people hear is, oh, your idea, your God of individual rights is more important than the actual individuals who exist and who would suffer because of your policy. Or we say, we have to abolish the FDA because people have the right to take any drug that they want. What they hear is, oh, I don't care about the people who are going to be harmed by this policy. All I care about is my God, capitalism, and this blind belief in the rationality of individuals. So let me clarify this in two ways. So one is, you might think, well, look, there's a bunch of philosophic assumptions that they're building into those. And that's certainly true. It's certainly true that you can point out the flaw in this idea that if you get rid of the welfare state, people will suffer. It's certainly true that behind their analysis of the FDA is an assumption that businessmen are kind of greedy and reckless, and that's what the profit motive encourages them to do, is put bad drugs on the market. But what I'm drawing attention to is a different or wider issue. It's that formulated in the way that I did, it really does convey, and we often in a number of ways, which I'll talk about, convey that we do care about more about ideas than people. I once heard, and I won't name him because he was not endorsing this as exactly the right attitude, although he wasn't fully distancing himself from it, but a very high regarded, somebody I regard highly in objectivism, say that when he was young and first read Atlas Shrugged, his attitude, he still believed, capitalism leads to depressions and monopolies and all of the standard fare, but to hell, I'm for capitalism anyway because I'm going to be a principled supporter of individual rights. And my point is that that's the wrong attitude, that the right attitude is I want individuals to flourish, starting with myself. And my principles are only useful and meaningful insofar as they're a means to that. And so it should be a big alarm bell if you have a principle that says, thou shalt subject people to widespread suffering in the name of my dogma, essentially is what it would amount to. Clarification number 2. One of the things objectivism gives you, though, is a very unique perspective on what it means to want people to flourish. So the conventional view is just, I want everybody to flourish. I want everybody to prosper, everybody to have the healthcare they want, everybody to find success and happiness. In one respect, certainly, like that's the right attitude. Like all else being equal, you don't want you would love it if everybody was flourishing, but we are not Christians. And capitalism doesn't ensure that everyone flourishes in this sense. I mean, no social system can do that or should try to do that. The right attitude is, I want people to flourish insofar as they're good, rational, productive, peaceful, moral. Insofar as they are pursuing the good, we want them to flourish. And to the extent that they're not, we want them to do better, but above all, we don't want them to be able to impose the consequences of their irrationality on good people. And so the right attitude is, I want people to flourish, but fundamentally that means I want them to make good choices. And if they don't, well, then they will pay for those mistakes. And I don't want the good people to pay for those mistakes. And I don't want the social system to impose the consequences for their irrationality on others. So it's still a fundamental attitude of what I care about as people. It's not putting ideology over people. It's a perspective on what it means to value people, which means to recognize that they have responsibility, a responsibility that reality gives us to flourish. And that wanting the best for others doesn't mean viewing others as having the duty to sacrifice for them if they're unwilling to actually take the steps to make their life best. It can still mean, even if you know somebody who's making bad choices, wanting them to make better choices. But it's not viewing it as now to want the best for people is to take on the duty to try to protect them from the consequences of their irrationality. In the end, that's bad for them, and it's certainly unjust for everybody else. So I'm going to go in next to a number of different ways, including some non-obvious ones that we put ideology above people, but any questions or thoughts at this point? And again, feel free to unmute or to type something into the chat or send a letter, but I doubt it will get here in time. Because we all know the post office is biased and trying to suppress the liberty movement. Well, at least let me know, is this interesting, self-evident? Are we getting value so far?
Oh yeah, I'm finding it very interesting. Yeah.
Awesome. All right. So now we're going to get into the ways that this actually shows up. I gave some rough examples, but as I was sitting thinking about this, it was surprising to me how often we come across and can come across as putting ideology above people. So, I mean, the main thing is treating abstractions as commandments, right? Reasoning to abstractions. So X is wrong because it violates rights. Now, that's like, sometimes you're arguing, yes, this is bad because it violates rights. But if that's all you say, and often it is the kind of heart of the kind of articles I see in the speeches I hear people give, a partial solution, but only a partial one, is one that explicitly ties principles like individual rights to a human flourishing goal. So it's something like, I want human beings to flourish, and that means a society where their rights are protected so they can live by their own judgment. But because that is such a complex perspective to get and understand, it really takes a full theoretical article like Man's Rights for people to really grasp the connection between rights and the ability of individuals to flourish. It still amounts to, in the listener's mind, more often than not, if that's all you say, that, well, that's sort of like a deductive, hand-waving presentation of, no, this will really be good for people to obey rights wherever the hell, it leads, even if it seems like it's going to lead to people starving in the streets. Don't worry. I've given you a QED argument for why this will be good for people, but you haven't painted the actual causality of why the policy that you're endorsing or opposing will lead to the flourishing of individuals. So the full solution, the right way to actually do this is, and I talk a lot about this in my course, Persuasion Mastery, is you're using abstractions to illuminate the concretes rather than arguing to the abstractions. So you would point out how when you violate the rights of producers, we're talking, to take the example of the welfare state again, when you do violate the rights of producers, you're causing unjust harm to these individuals and ultimately to all productive, rational individuals. I'll have more to say in that, but just in pattern, the idea is you use the fact that something violates rights to then paint the picture of the destruction that it leads to. But the focus is on the destruction. The rights are there, in effect, as a flashlight that help us see the non-obvious ways that redistributing wealth is destructive, versus you're turning the light on the abstraction, saying, look at that violates rights. No, the rights are there only to help you and your audience understand the damage. The next is not acknowledging, the next way in which we seem to put ideology above people is not acknowledging what's plausible about the other side. So for example, saying that the welfare state takes money you earn and gives it to other people, but not acknowledging or showing genuine concern for, okay, but what happens to the people who are no longer going to get welfare and who suffer through no fault of their own, and just at most saying, oh, don't worry, private charity will take care of it. That is, again, it comes off as if you're not seriously concerned about the fate of those people, or that you're pretending that those people don't exist. Like that there's not good people who at certain points in their lives will find themselves unable to earn money and not being blameworthy in those kinds of circumstances. And the way I think about the solution to something like that is to proactively bring in the perspective of the moral person suffering through no fault of their own. More widely, the solution is that you are going to be the one to account for what's plausible about the other side, and really appeal to how your ideas help solve this. But just to take the example of the welfare state, one of the things that I would do when I was really focused on this issue, and it really resonated with people, was to say, look at the welfare state through the eyes, not of the person who's whose money is being taken. Look at it through the eyes of the person who needs help. And I say, like, if you really needed help, would you go to your neighbor and pull a gun and say, give me help, I'm entitled to it? Or would you ask, and if they said, look, I love to help, but putting my kid through college. I'm trying to save for a new house. Would you totally understand that and not want their money? Look for somebody else who's worthy to help. And then I make the point of, like, wouldn't you have the conviction that unless you were like the worst SOB ever, who didn't have family, friends, neighbors, community, public charities that were willing to help you, like, wouldn't you be confident you could find help, let alone you'd probably be able to find some way to make money? And, you can even give them specific things that you've seen people do, when they were down to their last $20, to like go to a garage sale and be able to find $40 worth of stuff that they could sell on eBay. In other words, rather than me elaborating on that for 30 minutes, the point is that you're really showing that you're thinking about these kinds of cases and how good people would deal with them, and deal with them in a very psychologically real way, in a moral way, and in a very practical way. And as a flip side of that, I would go on and point out all of the harms that result to all of us, including how many people need help who wouldn't need it in a free market, where, for example, a person who's making $7 an hour still has upwards of 12% of what they're worth taken from them by the government just for Social Security and Medicare taxes. It's actually 6.2%, but you have to double that. I think it might have gone up, but you have to double that because some of it is nominally paid by the employer, but really comes out of, for the most part, the potential earnings of the poor person. But so you see, you can paint that picture of, you're concerned about the productive person who's looted in order to pay for the welfare state, but you're also concerned with the person who would need help, and you're going to show how your ideas address both of those rather than just being dismissive of the one. So the next category is misapplying objectivism. And we'll take the welfare state example. So this really came up in the PPP discussion for those. This is the, COVID-19, whatever you call it, stimulus bailout money, and the way in which the Ayn Rand Institute took the money, and very proudly took the money, and said why that was a matter of principle, and got a lot of blowback. I don't want to relitigate that because I know it was controversial, but though if anybody wants to ask in the Q&A period, you're allowed to ask whatever you want. So I guess I walked into that one. But one of the things that, if you really understand objectivism, is that objectivism's opposition to the welfare state is targeted at supporters of the welfare state, not recipients. And that we make a big distinction between those two. That what we regard as immoral are poor and rich people, intellectuals, like anybody on any scale who supports the welfare state and promotes it and think this is a moral thing to do. That's what we're opposed to. That the recipients, the very fact that they're receiving it, leaves open why and how they view that. And Ayn Rand is not a conservative. Like, she is not sitting around, bitching about welfare queens and things. It was, who are the people above all who promote the idea of the welfare state? And so that's just one example, but the point is that we often, many times when it's seen that you're putting ideology above people, it's because you're on the wrong ideological premise. Objectivism is ultimately just concerned with actual people, good people living their lives and achieving their values. And so if you deviate from that and you get the philosophy wrong, you'll be unnecessarily putting your ideas at variance of the actual flourishing of real people. So the solution, the ultimate solution is learn the philosophy better. And we're going to talk about that later in the meeting. But I would say just one sort of rule of thumb is, if you find yourself saying something that a conservative would say, or even a liberal, or even a libertarian, I would say in many cases, if not most cases, you've probably got the philosophy wrong. One of the lessons I've learned is how different even very similar positions are in terms of how they're argued for, framed, and understood by Ayn Rand versus anybody else in the culture, which shouldn't be surprising in the abstract because the philosophy is so different. But you guys have had to seen this, at least online, of how many people will make the point of, like, Yeah, in effect, they view objectivism as like a more consistent version of conservatism, something like that, or a more philosophic version of libertarianism, like it's libertarianism plus ethics and epistemology or something. But if you really take seriously the philosophy, even very similar things will often be framed in very different ways by objectivism. And so the more you understand the philosophy, the less likely you will to fall into the trap of seeming to put ideas ahead of people. Finally, I'd say non-objective moral emotions and moral language. When I was at ARI, somebody, and it actually very well could have been me, I don't remember, wrote a press release when there was the first plastic bag ban. If you remember this, I think California might have done it, or maybe it was probably a city. It was probably LA or San Francisco. And it was written, I don't even know if we publicly released it. We might have caught it before then, but it was written in such a way that it had the same kind of righteous indignation and tone of denunciation as if like the government had banned fracking. And I remember Onkar coming in and saying, like, this is ridiculous. This is bad, but like you actually have to have a like scale of badness. And notice, if your view is anything that impinges upon my philosophy, my God philosophy, is a travesty, that is very likely to happen. Whereas if you're focused on the scale of how does this actually impact human beings, your view would be, yeah, this is bad, and it should be like, we should reject it. But if you're putting it on that kind of scale, it's absurd, because you think, well, man, what kind of righteous anger am I going to get? Like when, somebody punches my kid in the mouth, right? Like I should probably save some of that for actual lives being harmed or destroyed. And a different version of that is so that's a version where you're being non-objective in the sense that your evaluation is non-objective. You're treating something that's kind of like annoying and bad and ridiculous and kind of mildly harmful. You're putting it in the same category as something that's catastrophic and really morally outrageous. There's another version where it's not your evaluation that's non-objective, it's your emotions or moral language are non-objective qua communication, in terms of you haven't laid the context for people to understand why you have such a major negative or positive evaluation. And I hope he'll forgive me for telling this story, but I remember years ago, Yaron and I were at a party in Hollywood, and it was like a party where he was supposed to give like a 10-minute speech in the middle of a living room, standing on like a literal soapbox. And he was doing a pretty good job. People were really liking it. And then he came out and said at some point, Mother Teresa is evil. Now, I think he's right. Like, I think that is totally true, but you could see, or you didn't have to see it. You could he lost the audience completely. They were angry. They would turn their backs. They went off and said, all right, get me 10 more shots of vodka, because I got to drown out the pain this guy has put me through with his ridiculous views. And it's simply because this was something that he had not laid the groundwork for. Like, it's hard to get that somebody who stands in people's minds as a symbol of a moral saint is actually somebody who's deeply immoral and having a real negative impact on the world. And so the point is not that you should never have controversial views. It's that whenever you are being non-objective in terms of your language and your moral emotions, you'll alienate your audience. And part of what you're alienating them for is the way that they saw it is not that Yaron thinks she's evil because she's reaping destruction of herself and of the people around her. They see it as, oh, you don't like it because she goes against your dogma. That's how they see it. And that's the way that they will see these kinds of non-objective statements. So the overall solution is to communicate with the audience in mind. And obviously this is a theme that I keep coming back to, but that's because it really is the root of almost everything good in communication and persuasion, is that the more you're on the premise of writing and speaking in order to help the audience solve a problem or achieve a goal, the more you're orienting yourself in a healthy, pro-individual, pro-flourishing way versus preaching an ideology, the more that your orientation is, I want to win converts or like defend my ideology, my philosophy, that's going to come through in ways that you'll be perceived as putting ideology over people. So that's what I have to say about that topic. Any thoughts or questions on that? I should say it's definitely, there's probably many more ways that people do this. And so if you guys have any theories or suggestions on that, that would be really cool to know. But these definitely jumped out at me as at least some of the most obvious and prominent examples of putting ideology over people. So it definitely was not meant to be exhaustive. That's one of the nice things about objectivism is we're not Kantians who feel like we have to like give every single possibility and category of the true and the wrong. We just get to point out the important ones. Go ahead, Mark.
Yeah. Is some of this related to just the idea of kind of the arguing to 100 to really putting out there the positives so that you're not on the defensive, just, trying to bat back something, but that you're saying, and in the case with people, that yes, what I'm advocating is the best for people. That's why I'm advocating for it, and kind of turning those tables, because the left has done a good job of positioning all of their or most of their positions as being pro people, right? And you see that in terms of whether it's dealing with robotics or and computerization or industrialization. It's no, we got to preserve this for people, and showing that the pro-liberty is really a more powerful pro-people approach than what they're advocating.
Yeah, that's a really good question. So just so that people have some context, the idea of arguing to 100 is Alex Epstein's way of thinking about persuasion. And the idea is that in any debate, somebody's framing the debate. They're framing, you think about a spectrum from -100 to 100, where -100 is the lowest evil, 0 is nothing, and 100 is the highest good. And when people frame a debate, what inevitably they do is say, like, I'm me, my policies or whatever, we're pushing to the highest good, and then we're framing our opponents as pushing to the lowest evil. And then what Alex points out is that if you don't rearrange that framing, what inevitably happens is that you end up arguing to 0, which is I'm not as bad as they say, and they're not as good as they think. And whereas what you want to do is reframe the debate so that what you are doing is defining what is the highest good and what is the lowest evil. So in energy, right, the highest good is supposed to be being green, not impacting the planet, and the lowest evil is making the planet unlivable. And then he's going to reframe it so the highest good is human flourishing, and the lowest evil is being anti-human. And I would say the discipline of reframing along the lines that Alex talks about it does help you not engage in this problem, because what you're doing is that when you're reframing, you're very conscious of, all right, what's our goal, and our goal is always going to be some aspect of human flourishing. Whereas what is often happening when people are being perceived as putting ideology above people is that they're implicitly taking their abstraction as the goal. So they're treating individual rights as the goal. And that's why they feel like, all right, I'm proving that this violates rights, and therefore it's game over. But unless you're tying rights causally and clearly to the well-being of individuals, then from the audience's perspective, since they do not really see rights as a inextricable link to human beings' ability to flourish, they perceive that as rights above people. And the fact is, if you really talk to most objectivists on many issues, they don't fully get the causal link between rights and the well-being of individuals. themselves. And that's why they're not painting that picture of how violating rights really is destroying lives. And so, in the past, I've encouraged people, like, read Ayn Rand, like, read her account of the draft. She doesn't just say this violates rights and then goes home. She's painting the way in which violating the rights is, like, vividly destructive of individuals. Or if you look at her take on abortion, she doesn't just say people have the right to abortion. She explains what happens when that right is taken away from women and paints that picture. When she talks about the anti-industrial revolution, environmentalism, she makes vividly clear what an anti-technology attitude would really mean in the world for real people. There's always this focus on the consequences for individuals in reality, and the abstractions are there in order to help us understand and see those negative consequences. But there's not, as a rule, she's not just like, this violates rights and then, okay, we can go home. So yes, if you're thinking about how do I reframe the debate in terms of what is the right human flourishing based goal, then by that very fact, you're naturally going to focus on making clear how this is really good for individuals and how my opponents are really bad for individuals, rather than treating your abstractions as an end in itself. But this is one reason, but people can still go wrong here, because I think that some people haven't really mastered what Alex is trying to do. Will often think, okay, I'm going to frame the debate in terms of individual rights versus statism or something like that. It'll be some set of abstractions. And so I think, it doesn't guarantee that you'll be successful, but I think that's a good insight into a good integration. Any follow-ups on that? All right. Other questions on this topic? I have one more objectivism related thing to go into, but I'm definitely curious for any thoughts or follow-ups on this. And as I mentioned, because I think some people came in late, feel free to use the chat if you do not want to use your voice, and I'll even be happy to take anonymous questions. Okay, cool. Well, we can come back to this in the open Q&A portion, but why don't I go ahead and mention this next section, because this is where I really want all of your feedback. So a week or two ago, I guess last week, maybe it was, I put up a question of, like, who is interested in promoting objectivism as a career, or at least as, a serious hobby, and got, I think, 50 or 60 people to fill out a survey. And it was really fascinating. And one of the things I learned was that so much of what's keeping people from being more active in promoting objectivist ideas is certainly, some people wanted to be stronger in communication and persuasion. And that's obviously been the major part of what I've been doing. But a lot of people were really focused on not feeling well enough grounded in the philosophy, which was it wasn't surprising to me. I was very happy to see that people were that self-aware, but it definitely underscored for me the idea that if I want to be successful at my mission, which is I want good ideas to succeed, which means I want more people advocating them and advocating them more effectively, insofar as I can have an impact on that piece of the puzzle, I wanted to have an impact. And traditionally, what I've done is encourage people to go through the OAC, and I continue to do that. It's certainly, you get access to some of the best, minds in objectivism, some of the best resources in objectivism. Above all, you get to learn from Onkar Ghate, who is just the best teacher of objectivism as a philosophy I know of. And Leonard aside, but he's not teaching these days. So unless you're friends with him, good luck. But that's not sufficient. And in part, it's that not everybody can get into the OAC or be able to afford the auditor payment. Even if you do go, some people just don't have the time. Some people have other reasons for not wanting to do it. And even if you have gone through it, you always want to reinforce, learn more. And so the first thing and initially I was hesitant to do anything on the philosophy per se, for a number of reasons. Number one, there's just so many great resources online. Like, I mean, there's hundreds of hours of Leonard's courses, Harry Binswanger, lectures by Onkar Ghate and Tara Smith and Greg Salmieri and many others. And that's not even including all the books and articles that are written. And I thought, all right, well, like with that treasure trove available, like what am I really going to add? And also, like, I'm not a philosopher. Like, I know a lot, but there's a level that you get to when you study philosophy professionally, a level of precision, a level of understanding the contrasting ideas, which helps you not just criticize those, but explain your ideas. But in the end, there were three things that convinced me, or at least three things. One is just simply that I would learn a lot myself from, okay, let me try to crystallize everything that I've learned, you know, over the course of 20 years. And you always, it's said that the teacher is always like the biggest beneficiary of teaching. And I think that really is true. So I knew that I would learn a lot and have just a ton of fun creating that. And in fact, the hard part now is that I have a bunch of other assignments, including a novel that I have to figure out how to force myself to continually sit down and revise. But this is just so exciting. It's hard to keep myself away from. The second is that I think there is a value in me as somebody who's gone through all of that material. Probably many of those things I've gone through more than almost anybody else on the planet, because I really have been obsessive my whole life about learning objectivism. Like, I really did very little else. And so just to be able to take that learning and the fact that I had access to many of these people, you know, personal access for years, and be able to synthesize that and make it publicly available, all kind of the best of in one place. I thought, well, that could be a value, even if people have gone through these other courses, or to, you know, save them some time if they can't go through all of them. So I thought that would be a value. And then the third thing is just that, you know, I'm primarily, I've always viewed my role as like, what I'm good at is taking, you know, delving deep into like the academic literature on different topics, whether it's philosophy or economics or whatever the case may be, and then synthesizing that in a really accessible way. So I don't view myself primarily as like adding a lot in terms of the content, although hopefully I do add, you know, something in terms of the content. It's not just taking what other people have said and regurgitating it in a more accessible way. But certainly I think that's one of my strengths, is communicating ideas that are complicated in a way that is much easier to take in for somebody who's not an academic, somebody who's not a scholar in the field. And so, you know, the idea that, okay, well, let me do that with objectivism, I think there could be a real value in that. And in particular, doing it in a way that highlights its usability and practicality. So if anybody's listened, I've started, my first endeavor here was, all right, I'm going to do a section by section commentary on Leonard Peikoff's book, Objectivism, the Philosophy of Ayn Rand, of which I released the first two installments rather. And it's a commentary in like the traditional sense, where I'm not going to like go over every single point. I'm assuming you've read it, and I'm just going to use that as an opportunity to kind of riff and add, like, here's what I think is important. Here's some additional points. Here's, you know, analogies that might be helpful. Here's some questions you should be asking yourself about it. One of the things I really want to stress is the usability and practicality. So in the second installment, I'm doing the basic axioms. And a lot of what I'm trying to hammer home in those videos is like, why does this matter? Why the hell should we care about existence exists and A is A? Like, how will this help my life? And if you watch the video, I think you'll see there's some stuff there that's not necessarily obvious. And I think a lot of people miss about why Ayn Rand starts with the axioms and puts such a big emphasis on them, and how they can be used in your own thinking in life to be a better thinker and more efficacious actor in the world. So all that said, this is just the first endeavor. So what I was curious to ask you guys are just a few questions on, because obviously you're pretty engaged with my work. And so it's, what would you like to see from this particular series? Like, what would give you the most value out of it? Or what do you think would help the people who would benefit from it get the most value out of it? What else could I be doing to foster greater understanding of objectivism? Any thoughts on how to bring this to the attention of people interested in Ayn Rand's philosophy? So far, I've just shared it on my social media, but if you have any thoughts on wider distribution, I'd love to hear that. And then finally, I want to spitball an idea that I think could be really useful and really fun, which is, in effect, seminars where people are writing papers on a topic, not for necessarily that they want to publish or anything, but just laying down how they understand or are struggling to understand particular issues. And then, seminar style, having, whether it's at this group or maybe I'll have separate meetings for it, where we discuss that. I give feedback, and others can give their feedback. I thought that could be fun, but people would have to actually be interested in doing it. So the floor is open at this point. I'm curious for any thoughts, feedback on any of that stuff that I just raised. So if you want to speak, just unmute yourself or type into the chat.
Yeah, I'll just start out by saying, I found it incredibly valuable because, and it was some of that little side riffing and putting in context. You're talking about things that are very abstract. I think Opar is a tough read in terms of it's dry, but dry on purpose, and it's very dense. And just some of the little, commentary and things about, like, you mentioned the car accident thing, and just accepting, relating that to the A as A, I found enormously helpful in terms of just integrating it better. And although I read most of OPAR last year in connection with the OAC first year, just revisiting it, kind of looking back, was just very helpful in terms of, again, just getting it that much more integrated. So I think that aspect of it's tremendous value.
Thanks. Harry, I saw that you just signed on. Just to give a context of where we are, I'm basically asking for feedback on things I can do, including my current section by section stuff on OPAR, for things I can do to help make it easier for people to understand the philosophy. So it's any thoughts you have will be well appreciated. Comment from Ricardo: both projects sound useful. I'm particularly interested not only in understanding the philosophy, but in seeing how it applies to day-to-day affairs. Yeah, I mean, I think that's definitely an area where a lot can be done. I mean, the only resource I think we really have that's gone into that in depth was Leonard's podcast. He got a lot of questions on the day-to-day affairs side, which is really interesting. And in fact, somebody was reminding me of that podcast, and I'm eager to now go back and read the book, where you get kind of his applications. But yeah, I think we need more of that. And I intend to do some of that, although I don't. That's a hard assignment, because often the things that people want applications to are like the trickiest kinds of applications. But yeah, I like that.
Can I say something?
Yes, absolutely.
Yes. What I was thinking about is, you mentioned that you're dealing with, you're going section by section, but thinking in other useful analogies, examples. I think that could be very useful because I think one problem, at least that I have sometimes, is that I always stick with the same examples, the same analogies that either pick up or Rand use. So I would like to, if you could encourage us to think outside that same formula.
Yeah, that's a really good point. There's a real virtue in having kind of standard examples that we just use as shorthand within the movement, like, because then, if you're trying to make a separate point, people aren't stuck on your example. So like, all right, concept formation, chair, furniture. All right, everybody gets what you're doing and we can move on to whatever kind of new point you're making. But I always get annoyed by that. I'm like, man, why can't you like give us something new, right? Like I want to like dog and animal, come on, like something. But yeah, that's definitely something I want to emphasize is having a lot of examples of these things, a lot of relatable examples and analogies and things that are not sort of standard. Although there are certain issues where I will be very wary of doing that. I think there's certain technical issues, and I'll tell you when I get there, things that, there's things that I don't feel that I deeply understand and will rely on sort of traditional examples, or at least those may come up. Because one of the things I'm also trying to emphasize as I go through is the areas where I am not haven't mastered. I think I mentioned on today's episode, there's certain issues about axiomatic concepts and time where I kind of get what Ayn Rand is saying, but I would never pretend to be able to just like throw it out there like, oh yeah, I get this. This is all totally clear to me. Because I think that's also part of what I want to contribute is that these ideas are hard, and somebody can have a lot of knowledge and yet not have omniscience about it, which, it's just so important to acknowledge what you know, what you kind of know, and what you don't know. So if there are points that I want to cover that I don't feel like I have mastery about, it's similar. I mean, Leonard himself has done this. One of the points that he makes when he's talked about OPAR is that when he got to the section on art, this was an area where he did not have mastery, and he stayed very close to what Ayn Rand said, including the kinds of examples he gave. And the main thing is I'll always try to be clear with people where in effect, the epistemological status in Don's mind of the very points I'm talking about. Harry says, perhaps not use the example of the iPhone to illustrate everything about capitalism, which is a gentle nudge at Iran, and probably I'm sure I've done it from time to time, although not in the last few years, because people now, like I would say a non-insignificant portion of iPhone users do not remember a time in their world where they did not exist. So it does not feel like an amazing creation. And even among the rest of us, they're so normal that it doesn't have the impact that it once did. But yeah, I'm definitely partial to new examples and unexpected ones. So and it's an area where, I'm not going to come up with a new point in epistemology, although, well, I won't go there. But I hopefully can come up with new interesting examples and analogies. In fact, I should say, just to compliment myself for a second, I was really happy with the 3 paths analogy for the importance of starting points, which was just something that occurred to me as I was coming up with it. It really captured for me how important starting points were in a really vivid way. So hopefully there'll be a lot of that sort of thing. Any other thoughts? Well, cool. So I'm definitely going to at least try putting together at least one sort of seminar style thing where convince some people to, write a paper or 3 and, see if we can't go through them. And again, Ricardo asks, what do I have in mind? I mean, essentially it's like, for instance, Ludwig von Mises had his famous seminars, and basically what he would have the students do is he would say, all right, write something on, capital and interest, like just some aspect of that. And then, one of the students would come in with their analysis, and then Mises would in effect just use that as a basis to point out oh, you're making this kind of error, here's how to really understand it. It's just what you're doing is using it as a basis for discussion. In part, what you're trying to elicit is the kind of common mistakes or sort of failures to push your own understanding as far as it could go. And I've really enjoyed those. Leonard Peikoff gave a similar thing. Not that I have any fantasies about matching this, of what he called confusion papers, where he would have his students write on a short paper on an issue and objectives and they were confused on, and then he would give these masterful analyses where he would do what he used to describe Ayn Rand being able to do, where he would show how like a one little word choice in the first sentence would allow him to know exactly what the major mistake would be, at the end of it. And they really were amazing. And I have no fantasies again about being able to equal that, but there's a lot I can do, and I think would be really fun to do. And it would give people, one thing it gives people an opportunity to do is in effect test their knowledge and then help others, understand an issue that they find fascinating or interesting. And, you can get this from the OAC. Like there's many opportunities where you'll get ONCAR's feedback on papers you write, but part of what we're trying to do is just have something that's open source, right? Like I put everything out there on YouTube, and what we're trying to do is create a library of content on objectivism, on persuasion, on communication that is there for everybody, like that they can learn on their own time, zero cost, and so that people who are coming up, including all of us, we have the best ability to learn these ideas in the fastest way possible. And and then you can always go to the more traditional routes of the OAC and so on. But it's really just trying to put it another way. There's endless opportunities to learn bad ideas on the internet. We want endless opportunities to learn good ideas. But I'm also open to suggestions for how to make that format even better. So, whether it's in this meeting or later, very eager for thoughts. I mean, basically, I have an open-ended assignment now that I want to produce as much great content as I can that will help people learn good ideas, communicate good ideas, and be persuasive with good ideas. And so, in effect, I'm expanding my own personal mandate to go be more focused on content. And I should say, I'm interested in the more political and kind of cultural issues, but I'm much more interested just personally in deeper issues in philosophy. And so hope to do more of that. In part, I want to break the impression that there is of me as somebody who's primarily like a political guy. The fact that my books have all been in that was the happenstance of what people were willing to pay me to write, not what I'm actually interested in, or not even what I'm most talented in. So, oh, my cats are destroying the world. Just like for people who don't have background, the reason I got hired by ARI was that, I had been, since I was an early teenager, writing on the internet about objectivist ideas, and most of what I was writing about was issues in epistemology and ethics. And in fact, I think a main thing that got attention was some ideas in epistemology I was working with that were like, it was basically defining a problem in terms of understanding how we form concepts of units that lack even the distinguishing characteristics. So like, how should we conceptualize a human being who's born without or with a very damaged brain? Because in what sense do they fit under the concept of rational animal? And so that's what I was doing at like the age of 17, which is, I think, not what most people who know my adult work would have expected. Okay, well, let's throw it open to general Q&A. And if nobody has anything, then that's cool. Then I can go finish watching Alien versus Predator. Very intellectual exercise. Really, it's a form of procrastinating on my novel. Okay, Robert. Easier to learn might include doing more of your suggestions below, trying to explaining objectivist ideas without access to objectivist terminology. Yeah, I mean, part of what I try to do is not necessarily explain things without objectivist terminology, but trying to take standard formulations and put them in different ways. And I think that's super useful. It's hard to do with the axioms because, in metaphysics, there's only so many ways to talk about, undefinable, unanalyzable concepts. But as we go through, I think you'll see a lot more of that. And I think that's a good point, because part of what you want, there's nothing wrong with the standard formulations, but the point is people have heard those and you want to hear them put in different ways, because one of the things you realize, I've always had a challenge as a speaker, which is I felt like if I repeat myself even once and somebody notices, I've somehow failed. But one of the things you realize is that, first of all, most people haven't heard it before, so they should get a chance to hear it. But another thing you realize, just as a consumer, like I'll get really interested in a speaker and I'll want to hear the same ideas because they'll put it in slightly different ways, or it'll come up at a different time. And it's amazing how often it's not some new idea you hear. It's the right idea at the right time that you might have heard 100 times, but it just strikes you in the right way and it changes your life. And so one of the things we want is objectivist ideas to be formulated in different ways that will ultimately connect with different people at the right time for them to get a new level of clarity. So that is certainly one of the things I want to do. Harry, I see your hand is up. If you're talking, you're on mute right now.
Okay, can you hear me?
Yes.
Dealing with a phone on this thing and trying to load my car at the same time. It's just...
That's fun.
I know I came in late, but I had sent you some things just on my idea of a second conversation, and I wondered if what you thought about the titles that I was using, if you had any thoughts on that, or kind of my approach to advertise it.
Remind me, I'm not offhand remembering this, which doesn't mean you didn't send it to me and doesn't mean I didn't read it.
Okay, the idea is that I'm putting together a panel discussion between two people on a defined issue where both people are thoughtful, but they come to different conclusions.
Right,
and
now I remember.
It is... I had pitched one to you, early on. And the twist on it is that they don't debate, that the second person repeats what the first person's idea is. And they keep doing that until the first person's satisfied. Yeah, you heard me. That's what I'm trying to say. And then they swap. So the whole purpose is to generate understanding, not debate, not, that kind of stuff. That would be later if you wanted to. And part of it is that I'm trying to focus on specific ideas, or a specific topic that's a little more focused. So for example, I haven't pursued this, or one of the ones I've pursued is the two Congress people running in my district have different views on qualified immunity. So I reached out to them and said, hey, let's have a conversation on that. They haven't answered. I'm not terribly surprised, but that's the sort of thing I'm trying.
It's a really interesting idea. And I've probably even talked about it in various places, or I know I have. Just as a thinker, we want to be able to articulate the other side or different viewpoints with even more clarity than they typically do themselves. And like, if, one of the things I'm most proud of in Equal is Unfair is that I think we gave the case against inequality in a more compelling, clear-cut way than the critics usually do. And so if you think even about, one of the tools in therapy that they both teach you but practice themselves is mirroring back what you said, not just repeating the literal words, but trying to reformulate it in their words, but in a way, is that what you're saying? Do I understand you right? And it's such a powerful tool. And they use it in couples counseling too, because part of what it creates is empathy, in the best sense of the word, of like, okay, I really understand where you're coming from. And then that becomes a much better basis for discussion. It doesn't necessarily lead to agreement, but it leads to much better discussions. The real, the key will be, can you get people to do it?
I know.
Because I think we live in an era where people don't want to have empathy with the other side. They want to own the other side and destroy the other side. And there's definitely ideas on the other side I do want to destroy. But I think it's a really fascinating project, and I'm glad you're doing it. And if you end up not doing it, somebody should, because it's one of those things I regard as a cool experiment where who knows how it will turn out. But man, somebody should try it.
That's kind of where I am in it, and I'm excited about it, and it just, I spend my free time kind of working on it. And that's the challenge is first to get through the noise. So for example, I want to do one on Islamophobia, and talk about a loaded term. But there's a woman within Toastmasters who's really well known and just an incredible speaker. And if I could get her and Alain Journeau together to talk about that subject, each present their own viewpoint, I think it'd be fascinating. And I think a lot of people would watch. But of course, on each side, it's, well, wait a second, who's this person I'm talking to? Are they just going to use me as a stalking horse? And I'm going to look, yes. They have to kind of know each other, meet each other. And the nice thing about somebody that, or people that have a public persona, is you can see their YouTubes. You can go check it out first. And that's sort of, how I'm approaching it. It takes a while. It takes a lot of patience. But those are the sort of things that, and then the other challenge is, I'm moderating the discussion, so to speak. And I will view it as a failure if I have to interject myself a lot, but I want to set a tone. Yet I definitely have an opinion on each of these subjects. But I don't want to sell that opinion. And so what I keep asking myself is, all right, am I interested in hearing what both these people have to say? And for me, it's, adamantly, yeah, I really am. This is going to be really neat. And then see how it goes. So that's about as far as I've gotten.
Yeah. And I mean, I've known amazing moderators who I know have very strong opinions. I don't remember who it was, but there was a series of debates ARI put on years ago. And for most of them, the moderators were not that great, but there was some where there was a person who I think was, left leaning, but he was so solid on just bringing out the best, making sure the conversation went as effectively as possible. And
what's they called, Axios or something like that? I think they're out of Boston.
Something like that.
Pitch was to have fundamental discussions.
Mm-hmm.
And I was so excited about it. A classmate of mine worked for NPR. NPR was all. And the first person who moderated, I agree with you. After that, it kind of went downhill. But the first person did that, and he would call on both sides. Hey, wait a second, you're not, on the subject here, and he'd bring him in. And that's the kind of, example or things that are in my mind that I'd like to be able to do too.
Yeah, definitely. Well, good luck with that.
Well, thank you.
Sincerely, good luck. Not like, hey, good luck. Cool. Any other questions?
Hey, Don.
Yes. Hey, Chad.
Can I mention something in response to Harry?
Absolutely.
To me, it strikes me as this is the kind of thing that might work really well, starting at a very, very small scale, starting with issues that are maybe technical issues within some topic, like, Don was saying, psychotherapy, getting people with different perspectives, or things that aren't going to be hugely controversial, and sort of practicing the method of being such a moderator and of establishing a track record and of establishing content that you can refer people to and of establishing an audience before trying to get into more contentious issues. And if you show up with an audience and with a track record that starts on a really small scale, that could lead to more success.
Yeah, good, thanks. I'll certainly keep that in mind.
All right. Any other questions, comments?
I have.
Oh, go ahead, Ricardo.
Okay, thanks. I have one. I wonder if you care to talk about how would not preaching philosophy look like in the issue of religion and morality? Because at least from my example, which was that the first issue I became interested in, I could very well point out the flaws in religious thinking, right? Saying something like, oh, you know, God is ultimately as subjective as our human conventions, right? But I was amazed that nobody was convinced by that. And it's not a surprise. So I guess my question is, what issues, and it's normal, right? Because religion is a huge value for most people. So what issues should one take care of in that, or should be alert in those cases, in that debate?
I mean, it so much depends on the person and where they're coming from. But I would say that at least a default assumption for me, and I don't necessarily know that this is true, but it's my default assumption, is there's this concept of the God of the gaps. And it was the idea that God is in effect an explanatory advice for things that we can't explain. And then that has shrunk as science expanded. And in effect, the last foothold is that there's this gap in morality. And so it is certainly true that the argument for God as a source of objective morality is wrong. And this is a point that objectivists, but non-objectivists have made too, which is in effect, it's just God's subjectivism instead of, you know, humanity's subjectivism. And I do think that can be a powerful point, but it's too much if that's where you're starting. And certainly if that's the only point you can make. In effect, what you're telling people or what they're hearing is you're smashing morality. So, I mean, imagine if you said like 2,000 years ago, hey, God doesn't explain, you know, the cause of rain or the cause of the sun rising. Well, if you don't have an alternative, more rational, compelling account, then you're just smashing our ability to, what you're seen as just smashing people's ability to make a coherent grasp of the universe that they have to deal with. Now, it's true. It's not a good explanation, even in that context. But if all you're doing is taking something down, I don't think rhetorically that's very effective, because people feel as if you're taking away and not adding. And so I think so much more important is that's useful to make as setting up, well, here's what a real objective account would look like. But the focus is on, I have a positive to offer. In other words, I'm getting rid of the gap that the God in the gaps survives by, which is that of morality. And one of the things we talked about last time is there's a certain difficulty in judging if your argument is effective in the moment you're giving the argument, because what it looks like to make a good argument is to have the person resist and say, no, that's wrong, because you're threatening their entire worldview. And particularly if we're talking about something like religion, and not even like we're not talking about social security or something, like you're talking about their fundamental worldview. And if a person's at all thoughtful and cares about ideas and takes ideas seriously, that if you're threatening their worldview, the idea that like they're going to have anything except for like a deep opposition to what you're saying is wrong. What will happen is at best you plant a seed that in some future time they'll come back and say, oh, that made a big impact on me. And so in that sense, it can be hard to test out your ideas. Often, you've struck a chord when you find that they're really going after an argument that you made, and they keep going after it. Because what is happening in those moments is that they're not satisfied with their answer, so they're trying again. If you've ever tried to answer, articulate your ideas in a conversation or a debate or you're teaching, that you'll keep kind of going over the same point again and again and again when you don't feel that you've really nailed it. So I would say one thing to look for as you're testing out what is really going to help in those situations is when do they keep coming back to one of your points again and again, because it means you've struck a chord and they don't feel that they're satisfied with their answer. They're not going to tell you, oh, that's a great point. Maybe once in a blue moon you get somebody to say, oh, I never thought of that. But don't depend on that. Look for when they're sort of chasing after a better explanation themselves. Now you've kind of struck a chord and you can double down. But my starting point is, am I pointing out flaws in order to set up a positive? And I want to stress a positive. And the positive, by the way, when we're talking about morality, this almost never means like, here's Ayn Rand's argument for the relationship of value in life. If you think about how we come to find objectivism compelling, often it's through the novels. And in the novels, yes, in Atlas Shrugged, you get a paragraph on the objective basis for values. True. But that's not why people agree with it. That's why they're ultimately able to know that they have a solid foundation. But what's attractive is just the sheer picture of Gall, Dagny, Rourke. In nonfiction terms, painting that there is a morality that says no sacrifice of anybody to anybody and that's aimed at your happiness and gives some sense of what that looks like, of a life built around purpose and reason and productiveness and an unblemished self-esteem. Like, it's painting the alternatives in a new way that is appealing, that gets people to say, oh, that sounds really interesting. So what I'm suggesting is that when I talk about like offering an argument for an objective basis, so much of it is not pinning down the technical argument that grounds morality, although you probably should mention it, right? Because if you're in the context of morality with an objective basis, but you don't really need the most sophisticated perspective. In effect, what you would say is, well, like, what could be more objective than, whether or not human beings flourish or die? And people can get that. Like, that's not the full case, but they can get, yeah, there is something really like solid about that we, and objective about that in the way that, oh, God said so. That seems not exactly rock solid. Any follow-ups on that?
No, I really like that idea of thinking in terms of what picture are you leaving them with, right? You don't want to leave them with just an argument or an axiom, but you want to see, oh, you want people flourishing or living their best, right? And that's something that perhaps, if you think about it further, religion cannot provide. So I think it's important to work in giving that image to people. But thanks.
Yeah, absolutely. And again, every person is different here. There's some people who are just very pro reason, and that's the thing that, like, all you have to do is, in effect, really dig into. You don't really have good reasons for this, although they usually have come to atheism earlier. But sometimes you'll encounter that. Some people are very pro morality. Some people, it's much more a psychological attraction. That's their social circle, and that's a different conversation. So you want to be very audience focused, but it's good to I have generally a default view of what I think the most important issues are. So that's how I think about it. Mark, were you going to raise something earlier?
Yeah, I had a question. Ben Bayer had an article earlier this week on this the dishonesty of real socialism has never been tried. And you know, when I think about conversations I've had with people, you know, sometimes I think it may go a little beyond dishonesty and into just this platonic kind of view of, you know, there's this socialism kind of archetype and this capitalism archetype, and you'll never have any perfect socialism, communism, or capitalism. So in trying to establish the false equivalency between, you know, well, there's never been real socialism versus there's never been real capitalism, because there really hasn't been real capitalism, right? How do you approach that, or how would you approach that to kind of get underneath that, you know, whether it's a platonic kind of, you know, well, it's never is going to be perfect anyway, or underneath just the way in the conversations, you know, there is this dishonesty that you need to sort out in terms of the real socialism has never been tried, but then again, neither has capitalism, or real socialism has been tried, but real capitalism hasn't.
Yeah, so I haven't read Ben's article, though I want to. So, you know, I might even just echo some stuff he said, in which case feel free to follow up. But here's how I think about that issue broadly. So it's certainly true that real capitalism hasn't been tried, but the most crucial fact is that the closer we've gotten, the better things have become, and the further away, the worse things have become. Whereas their view is that, like, that what they have to account for is every step towards socialism has actually made things a disaster. Even if they don't think it's perfect, like, you can't deny there's been places that have abolished private property of the means of production. Then the Khmer Rouge abolished money, and really, I mean, the Khmer Rouge, I think, is actually the best example, because they really took socialism seriously and bit the bullet in a way even the Soviet Union didn't. So I think that's the fundamental, but I don't think that's sufficient, because the second thing that you want to do is that in any mixed system, there's always a question of what's responsible for the good and what's responsible for the bad. And there, what you want is you'll want contrasting cases that help you elicit that, right? So at a broad view, what we would want to look at is we would want to see, for example, if there's a country that got more and less capitalist over time and what the results were. Well, as I've talked about in Equals Unfair, Sweden has a track record of periods of more freedom and more socialism, more capitalism, more socialism. And you can basically just draw a chart over that of more prosperity, less prosperity, more prosperity, less prosperity. And of course, you can look at contrasting countries that share similar cultures, like the East Germany, West Germany example. You can't, like, yeah, you can say that East Germany wasn't real socialism, but you can't argue that they weren't more socialist than the West, right? Like, clearly that's true. And you see what the results were. South Korea, North Korea. One of the guests on my podcast, who's Raina, I'm forgetting his last name, Ziedelman. He wrote a book on capitalism that apparently, I haven't read it yet, but we were talking about, like, he literally just does this. He gives all these contrasting examples that help bring this to the fore. And you can do the same thing at kind of an industry level of compare more and less free industries when they're free and less free. I was talking to somebody yesterday about, I think one of the challenges in healthcare is that this is very hard to do, because many industries that eventually were taken over by government, you can say, what did they look like before government got really involved? With healthcare, it's one of the unfortunate things is, at the same time that you started getting modern medicine, we were under the sway of the rise of progressives. And so at the same time medicine is becoming modernized, it's becoming more regulated and controlled. And so we don't really have a period of both freedom and advanced scientific knowledge in medicine from which to draw conclusions from. So that's a field where you basically have to scrape things together a little bit more. And you can say, okay, well, what are the most free pieces of healthcare? You know, it could be LASIK, it can be plastic surgery. We can look at vet medicine, which is, less regulated, although there's certain rhetorical problems with saying, look at how well dogs have it. But the bottom line is that the only way you can disentangle mixed systems is through contrasts and kind of semi experiments, and then having causal explanations that help us understand that. So the way I think about it is that what we see when we engage in that enterprise is a consistent pattern of more freedom leads to better results for individuals, and less freedom leads to worse results. And if you're going to say, yeah, but if we just got it perfect, everything would be perfect, that nobody's actually going to be convinced by that. That is like a kind of Platon, it is Platonic, but Plato is dishonest. Now, in a certain way, you can be a little bit sympathetic to his dishonesty. He was operating before Aristotle, so forgive the guy for getting everything really wrong. But on the other hand, he was worse than the general Greek culture, so you can only forgive him a little bit. But I'm sure that there's much more to say on this particular issue, or rather, let me put it this way. The other thing to say on this particular issue is, what do they mean by real socialism? Because what is often going on is that they're conflating their policies with their fantasies. So it's not real socialism if it doesn't lead to the, blissful freedom of the proletariat. Well, that's a result. You define a social system by its institutions and not by its fantasy intent, fantasy outcomes.
But then I'll hear, oh, but you just have this fantasy idea of capitalism that you're trying to promote.
But that's not true, right? Because
right.
what we're saying is not, hey, until you get my perfect system, you can't blame me for any of the consequences of capitalism. We own the consequences of freedom. They're disowning the consequences of socialism. We're not saying that you can't judge capitalism based on any existing system. We're saying that to judge it, you have to prove what came from capitalism and what came from the controlled element. That's the real key here. The key is that we are taking responsibility for freedom insofar as it exists. What we are not allowing them to do is automatically by default blaming every bad consequence on the element of freedom. What we're saying is, let's think about it. Let's investigate. Is this the free element? Is it not? Because for instance, if you take something like the poverty of 19th century capitalism, we're not saying oh, well, it wasn't perfect capitalism. What we do is, well, let's see, what was it really, where did that come from? And our argument is, well, that was inherited by eons and eons of poverty, and it was being cured by capitalism, but it was being slowly cured. And a better example is, something like a negative. So I would say, for example, that what would be the right example here? I mean, I would say, for example, you would have something like poor working conditions. It's not exactly the fault of capitalism. Part of it is inherited property. But part of what I would say is, this is an area that had to be solved through learning, and people under freedom did not recognize that it was actually bad for their bottom line as producers, not to, treat their workers better. So in a sense, you could blame capitalism, but what you're really doing is you're saying like capitalism gives people the freedom to learn, but that takes time, and people can make mistakes, and they can mistreat people in ways that don't violate their rights, but that you would say are immoral. But over the long run, they're outcompeted by the people who do it better. So it's, in a sense, I'll take responsibility for, there's bad stuff that I did not approve of under capitalism. And there might even be examples of things that I say are just, negatives that you just, that's the price you pay for freedom. I'm open to that. Nothing's occurring to me offhand. But yeah, that's how I think about it. It's that they aren't taking responsibility for their system, and we are.
Thanks.
Definitely. Cool. Anybody else? Oh, that reminded me of something that I skipped over when I was going through the way in which ideology gets put over people. So when I was responding to your question, Mark, one point I wanted to make was that it really helps in those debates if you know about socialism and about Marxism, right? Like if you've actually read Marx, and you don't have to read all of him, but if you've at least read, some of the key essays that he's written, and if you know like a significant amount about the history of the Soviet Union, of China, of the Khmer Rouge, of Cuba, of North Korea, like that really puts you in a much better position to address these than somebody who's in effect operating by just sort of a vague, like, well, it's the abolition of private property, and I know that like the Soviet Union did it. Like if the more you know about the concretes and about the doctrines of the ideology, the more you can really press this argument, where what will often happen if you don't know what you're talking about in any real depth is that they'll come back and say, yeah, well, but Marx said this and Marx said that, and they didn't do this and they didn't do that. And it will be much harder for you to articulate a persuasive argument in that case. And so this connects to a wider point, which is one of the ways in which we put ideology above people, or seem to be doing that, is when we are entering a debate uninformed. Because when we enter a debate lacking specific knowledge, and people grasp that we lack specific knowledge, what they see us is thinking, oh, you just think because you have a dogma, you can just, solve every problem. You don't actually have to know anything about reality. And so, like, for example, you might have philosophic reasons for thinking we should abolish the Federal Reserve, which is that this is the government taking control of the money supply. It doesn't have a right to do that. And so I don't think there'd be a Federal Reserve. But if you're going to decide to enter a debate over free banking and the Fed, but you don't know, for instance, the history of the problems that led to the creation that the Fed was intended to solve, and you get into a debate with somebody who's at all familiar with these things, then what will happen is that you will be, they'll get that, and they will see, first of all, they'll just dismiss you as, talking out of your ass. But to connect it to this wider idea, it's, oh, you don't really care. You're not really trying to solve these problems and make the best society for people. It's that you've got your hammer that is your ideology. And so everything looks like a nail that you feel capable of hitting. And so the point is not that you have to become an expert on every one of these issues in order to have the right to hold that view. I think it's totally like, life is short, and it's totally legitimate to say, yeah, I don't think there should be a Federal Reserve just on the basis of first principles. But if you're going to enter a debate where you're actively trying to convince somebody to change their mind on an issue, what I highly encourage is, like, pick your battles, pick the places where you have thought through things. There's plenty of those opportunities, rather than the ones where you're on shakier ground, because it's total, you can do more harm than good in cases where you are trying to argue just from your understanding of philosophy rather than having a more well-rounded understanding. And if a debate goes in that direction that you're already in, or a discussion does, what I generally recommend is what I always recommend, which is just authenticity and intellectual honesty, and say, so, in general, I don't think government should be involved in these areas, but this is just not an area I've explored a lot. And so you might use it as an opportunity to just get from them, so why do you think there should be a Fed? And now you can use that for ammunition, so that if you ever decide, I do want to make a study of this, you'll know, oh, these are the kinds of issues people would raise. But you're not pretending that you can defend your view in any really well thought out way. And I'm a big fan of that. And in fact, like this is part of my way that I deal often with sales, which is like, all right, if I can sell while trying to talk somebody out of buying, well, I feel really good about that sale. And I know it's a really solid thing. Like, I'm setting the expectations as low as possible. I'm not advocating that everybody, particularly if your job is sales, to do that. But my point is that when you set the expectation, so for instance, I mean, if I am going to debate a topic, even like the Fed, which I've written major pieces on and have spent probably 200 hours really studying at least. If I'm going in there with somebody who's sophisticated and studied economics, I'm still probably going to set it up as like, this is not an area where I have full expertise, because what that does is, I'm setting kind of the expectations low. And then if I have an impact, great. But if I screw it up, at least like they know that I'm self-aware enough to know that I'm not pretending to have mastery of this area. So thank you, Mark. You gave me a chance. I don't know how. I guess I don't look at my notes closely enough when I talk to you guys, because that was one of my favorite points to make, even though it's one of the trickier ones to solve, precisely because there's only so many areas we can be masters of. But it's amazing to me. This is one thing that baffles me, and maybe I don't read enough like Chomsky or something, but the left is just filled with these kind of like uninformed, uneducated, like hippie people, but they'll know just 30 weird ass facts about like, the kind of power sources that were used by the Contras back in like 1970s, like just this weird sort of stuff that gets thrown at you during these debates. And you think like, man, how the hell do you know this? And it must just be that there's a few sources they're reading I'm not, that kind of throw out these, facts. But I as a general trend, I find that the left, they're worse informed on the history of like actual, like, communism. They know nothing about it. But in terms of everything else, it seems that they're like just way more informed on sort of like history and facts than conservatives and libertarians are as a rule, which is really intriguing to me. I don't have a good view of why that is, except maybe that most histories and most basically most fact-based stuff, there's way more of it from the left, and so they're much more at home reading it than
so if they're reading it, if they're well read, then that's what it's geared to or slanted towards, so they're going to naturally pick up on a lot of that.
Whereas most of our best stuff is just very theoretical, and you have to work hard to get facts. I mean, I wrote Roosevelt Care not because I have any pretensions about being a historian, but because I wanted to, I knew that to give a solid argument in the welfare state, I needed to know more about the history of it. In fact, I remember I had a conversation with Alex back when we were both in our mid-20s, where he said, I was like, I'm kind of interested in this welfare state issue. And he goes, well, you probably should figure out what happened before the welfare state. So I was like, cool, I'll just get a book on that. And it was, holy shit, there's no book on that. Nobody in the free market world had written about what life was like and what people did. There were pieces of it here and there. If you read my book, Roosevelt Care, one of the things you'll notice is most of my references are left-wing sources, because they were the people writing about that era. And I basically would read an entire 300-page book by a leftist for one little fact or quote that was illuminating about how people handled poverty in that era. And it was really detective work to piece together.
Well, and also in that historical writing, there's not necessarily a lot of sensitivity to, and motivation to make a distinction between, this came out of voluntary associations and this came out of forced associations. So it's just kind of looking at all these institutions as, under this broad phenomena of institutions. And so kind of sorting out, how things really developed, and, from the point of view of even sorting out what came from free exchange or free association and what didn't, is very difficult, right?
Right. I mean, this is one of the points Ayn Rand makes in her first Ford Hall Forum talk, is that there's never really been a book or a full study that helps us parse out the exactly what we were talking about before. What were the consequences of lack of freedom and what have been the consequences of freedom in what we've actually seen in history, which is these mixed economies. And I think it's a travesty and speaks really ill of our priorities as a movement. And I mean the liberty movement broadly, that like, this is not a solved problem. There's pieces of it here and there. But we've been very weak on history. We've been very weak. And I mean, part of the problem is people in the liberty movement had done these histories, but it's usually garbage history, like, the Mises people on Lincoln and the Civil War. And, you can't trust anything that Rothbard says about history, but like having, real quality historical and economic history and things that help like do the work that all of us could really benefit from. I think we're still in the very early stages of having that work done. And there's just such an opportunity because, as much as I want to make philosophy easy to learn, a lot of what I was trying to do with my books was make capitalism easy to learn, but it was hard as hell for me to learn it because just there was no place to go for a lot of this. And that's why I was, very excited to run into Raina, because in a big part what he was doing is he was creating the resources after my books were written that I literally remember looking for when I was writing my books and not being able to find. So those of you both on the call, but especially watching on YouTube later, like this is your assignment. If you're more of a scholarly bent rather than kind of a crusader bent, this is the scholarship that we need. And there's still so much opportunity to do. All right. Any last questions or comments before we sign off? Thanks, Ricardo. All right, everybody, this has been a lot of fun as always, and I will let you guys know sort of obviously about the next Unlocking Liberty. If anybody both now or watching this video wants to participate in something like a seminar on Ayn Rand's philosophy where you'd write a paper and get feedback on it, let me know. And again, I'm still thinking through what this would look like, but if there is interest, email me at don@donswriting.com. And hopefully we could put something together on this, because I think it would be a lot of fun. And again, I mean, like, I just have this vision of what would I have loved to have when I was just starting out that we now have the capacity to make and create, put out there for free for everybody, for ourselves, and for the next generation that's coming up, because like there's just so much great stuff that can be done, and hopefully we can make a contribution towards doing it. Talk next time, everyone. Have a great rest of your weekend.